The fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm aren't as wholesome as they seem, and I'll tell you why. We've all wanted to be Cinderella at some point in our lives. I mean, who wouldn't? She's this hardworking young woman who gets a fairy godmother and a handsome prince. But what if I told you Cinderella isn't just about a girl getting a makeover, but about surviving cruelty? Or that Hansel and Gretel is really a dark metaphor for famine and parental neglect? That's right, there's a lot to unpack, so sit tight as we explore the deeper meanings these fairy tales carry for adults. Did you know the fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm weren't originally bedtime stories meant to lull children to sleep? I mean, these guys are called the Brothers Grimm. What else were we expecting? Did you catch the pun? No? That's okay. Anyway, they were initially created as warnings, grim, unsettling, and packed with lessons about survival, morality, and the harsh realities of life. However, over the decades of telling and retelling, these same grim tales have been softened to exclude some gory details. Marina Warner from The Beast to the Blonde on Fairy Tales and Their Tellers explores this rather well. She talks about how fairy tales evolved, particularly focusing on how the Brothers Grimm softened or altered them to fit changing cultural norms. No kidding, there are some themes we probably wouldn't get into cause YouTube just might give us the old censorship boot, and we wouldn't want that. Before we deep dive into the crazy fairy tale world these brothers popularized and the hidden meanings, let's talk about the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm. These two weren't just storytellers, they were scholars who set out to collect German folktales in the early 1800s. As we mentioned earlier, these guys didn't aim to entertain children. The brothers had one thing in common. They believed these stories held deep cultural wisdom, passed down through generations. But there was a twist they probably weren't expecting. The stories they found weren't nice and soft or even magical. They were dark, violent, and often disturbing. Take for example, in the original Snow White, the evil queen is forced to dance until she passes away in red-hot iron shoes. In Cinderella, the stepsisters actually do damage to their own feet to fit the glass slipper. But the thing is, these gruesome details weren't just for shock value or because the old storytellers loved gore. They reflected the harsh truths of the real world, lessons about greed, suffering, and resilience that adults of the time understood all too well. With this in mind, let's peel back the layers of 3 of their most famous tales to reveal the deeper, sometimes unsettling messages you didn't notice as a child. Let's start with the beloved Cinderella. We know the tale of the beautiful, kind young girl who was forced into servitude by her cruel stepmother and stepsisters after her father's passing. When a royal ball is announced, the stepfamily destroys her dress, but Cinderella's breakthrough arrives when a fairy godmother magically gives her a gown, glass slippers, and a carriage, with a warning that the spell will break at midnight. She dances with Prince Charming, but flees as the clock strikes 12, leaving a slipper behind. The prince searches for its owner, and despite her stepmother's interference, Cinderella tries it on. And what do you know? It fits perfectly! She marries the prince and they both live happily ever after, while her wicked stepfamily is left behind. This Disney retelling was so good that a second and a third movie was made to satisfy the viewers. It's a good thing they didn't have the actual version on screen, or else parents might have shown up at the Disney headquarters with pitchforks. Anyway, as you might have guessed, the original version by the Brothers Grimm is much darker. Published in 1812, a time of significant social change in Europe, their version, called Aschenputtel, literally ashful, is the tale of a girl who loses her mother and is forced into servitude. The story is quite similar to the Disney version, except that her stepsisters, desperate to fit into it, resort to bodily harm to fit the slipper, and the birds feast on their eyes as punishment for their cruelty. Wow. I can see why this had to be toned down a lot. Not sure many parents might have read this to their kids otherwise. Looking through the lens of an adult, it's pretty obvious that this fairy tale is a social commentary on issues such as class struggle, exploitation, and oppression, and even feminine power dynamics. How so? For one, the story highlights the stark contrast between the wealthy, aristocratic family and the impoverished working-class family. It's a dichotomy that serves as a commentary on social and economic disparities. Today, it's even become somewhat of a normal disparity. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and just like Cinderella, many people find themselves trapped in cycles of hardship, working tirelessly while those in power reap the rewards. Then there's the dynamic between women. The stepmother and stepsisters aren't just antagonists, they represent a specific kind of social gatekeeping, where women sometimes uphold oppressive structures rather than challenge them. A perfect example in today's world can be seen in workplace competition, social hierarchies, or even internalized misogyny, where instead of uplifting one another, some people tear others down to maintain their own status. In the end, Cinderella isn't just a children's tale, it's a reflection of societal struggles that still exists today. And speaking of societal struggles, let's move on to another classic tale that explores power, deception, and the consequences of isolation: Rapunzel. Whether it's Tangled or Barbie as Rapunzel, this fairy tale was one of my favorites for a reason. Not only does it blend adventure and romance, it also offers the thrill of escaping confinement. And for a young child who was restricted from doing several things, it was easy to relate to Rapunzel's longing for freedom. I didn't see this as a child, but now that I look back on it, the tower wasn't just a physical prison, it was a representation of all the rules, limitation, and "you're too young" restrictions that felt unfair at the time. Back then, watching her family break free and explore the world made me believe that one day I'd get to step beyond my own walls too, and possibly my own Princess Charming, whom I didn't get by the way. But beyond childhood nostalgia, Rapunzel is a powerful story about stability and self-discovery. The tale follows Rapunzel, a young girl whom a sorceress locks in a tower with no doors, only accessible by climbing her long golden hair. One day, a prince hears her singing and secretly visits, using the phrase, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." They fall in love, but when the sorceress discovers their meetings, she banishes Rapunzel to the wilderness and blinds the prince. After years apart, they reunite. Rapunzel's tears restore his sight, and they live happily ever after. Well, I don't remember that in any of the versions I read or watched as a child. Regardless, like I said earlier, the idea of a girl locked away in a tower for years only to be rescued by love and her own courage resonates deeply, especially in a world where people often feel trapped by circumstances beyond their control. And then there's her impossibly long golden hair that symbolizes beauty, power, and connection. From an adult perspective, Rapunzel can be re-examined as a reflection of historical and cultural fears, especially when it comes to female autonomy, parental control, societal expectations, and isolation. At its core, Rapunzel is a story about isolation, something that has long been used to control women in various cultures. The sorceress, who much to my dismay is often interpreted as an overprotective or oppressive parental figure, locks Rapunzel away under the guise of protection. Now, this is a pretty accurate representation of historical anxieties about female independence, purity, and the dangers of the outside world. In many cultures, women were sheltered to maintain their virtue, and Rapunzel is both a cautionary tale and a fantasy of escape. I quite liked the Tangled version for the sole reason that the sorceress, Mother Gothel, never hid her true nature from the viewers. She was there only for what she could get from Rapunzel and didn't give two thoughts about Rapunzel's well-being beyond what served her own interests. Mother Gothel was refreshingly transparent in her selfishness, especially since it was clear she was manipulating Rapunzel with guilt and fear. To me, this made Tangled feel more grounded in real-life toxic relationships, as the interpretation showed how control isn't always enforced with chains, but with words, false affection, and emotional manipulation. And when Rapunzel finally broke free, it wasn't just a physical escape, it was a triumph over psychological control, making her victory even more powerful. Our final Brothers Grimm tale is the classic tale of abandonment and parental neglect, Hansel and Gretel. I've got to admit, this one wasn't even on the list of my favorites as a child. In fact, it almost didn't even make it to this video. Why do you ask? Because it low-key traumatized me. Even though it was watered down to make it less controversial, I just couldn't get behind this story. This one's a bit of a wild one, so please take caution. To refresh your memory, Hansel and Gretel is a tale about two siblings abandoned in the forest by their starving parents, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs to find their way home. Unfortunately, birds eat the bread. Lost, they discover a house made of candy, owned by a witch who lures them inside. She plans to eat Hansel and make Gretel her servant, but Gretel outsmarts her, pushing her into an oven. The children escape with the witch's treasures and return home to their father, finding their cruel stepmother dead. Now wealthy and free, they reunite with their father, who welcomes them back, and they live happily ever after. Though forever changed. At first read, Hansel and Gretel seems just like another cautionary fairy tale. However, beneath the surface it carries deeper meanings that might resonate strongly with adults. And no, it's got nothing to do with the childhood lesson of not trusting strangers. First of all, the tale is a story of survival in harsh times. Keep in mind that although it was first recorded during the early 19th century, its origins likely stem from even older oral traditions. And if there's one thing we know about history, it's that famine and poverty have always been real threats. In times like this, abandoning children wasn't just a terrifying fantasy, it was sometimes a grim reality. And since the story reflects the anxieties of a world where desperation forces cruel decisions, an adult reader could interpret Hansel and Gretel's abandonment by their parents as a symbol of society's failure to protect the vulnerable. Then there's the theme of betrayal, especially from a parent. While children might view the stepmother as simply mean, adults recognize a harsher truth. Betrayal can come from those who should protect you. The father, though hesitant, ultimately gives in to his wife's pressure. It's an aspect of the story that mirrors real-life dilemmas where people make tragic choices out of fear, weakness, or self-preservation. And the witch? Well, to me she kind of symbolizes manipulative and corrupt individuals and systems that lure people in with promises of security or pleasure, only to exploit them. And isn't this a major problem in our world today? But there's still one lingering question. Is the story truly a happy ending? Yes, Hansel and Gretel make it back home with treasures from the witch, but their stepmother is already dead, and their father remains the man who once abandoned them. They triumphed, but at what cost? Now they have to live with a lingering discomfort and the man who agreed to abandon them simply because things were bad at home. In fact, in earlier versions, the mother was originally the one who abandoned the children. However, later versions changed her into a stepmother, perhaps to soften the idea of biological parents being so cruel. An issue like this raises the very real question of whether broken trust can ever be truly repaired. For an adult reader, this ending might come off as an open question about forgiveness, loss, and whether returning home is ever the same after a harrowing journey. So, the next time you revisit these childhood favorites, remember that they weren't just tales to entertain. They were warnings, life lessons, and sometimes straight-up nightmares in disguise. Have you noticed deeper meanings in any of the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales? Tell us in the comments. Also, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.